Well, thank you for that very warm welcome and that all too kind introduction. But please be afraid, be very afraid, because back in the UK, the Sun newspaper once called me the most dangerous woman in Britain. You can imagine that's a title that one can dine out on for many years. It can get you all sorts of different receptions in different parts of the UK. So imagine my disappointment when, in the run-up to last year's UK general election, that's in 2015, a rival newspaper, the Daily Mail newspaper, decided that I was a bit past it and no longer worthy of that title, which had instead been stolen by a charismatic Scottish nationalist politician north of the border. And friends, to add insult to injury, the First Minister of Scotland is actually a little bit younger than me as well. You've heard the joke about the policemen and the school teachers. Well, it ends up being the Prime Ministers. But it is an enormous pleasure and privilege to return to Australia and to come to Brisbane for the first time, and in particular to give a lecture in Sir Samuel Walker Griffith's name. As you've heard, there are probably few people anywhere in the world who can have served in both the elected and judicial branches of a democratic constitution with such distinction, not least in playing such a hand in drafting it. Human rights protection often lives in that very contested place between law, policy, and politics. But the suggestion that Griffith himself thought, self-described, that he was a lawyer first and a politician second is, I think, something to be admired, particularly when fundamental rights and freedoms are on the line. I last came to Australia just over 3 years ago, and so much has changed in my country since then. In fact, I wrote early drafts of sections of my book on liberty in a Sydney hotel room, late at night, fueled by jet lag and a growing concern at the state of rights and freedoms in my country, in Europe, and the wider world. And of course, the jet lag passed with time, but the concern, I'm afraid, has only grown. The hardback of the book came out in the autumn of 2014, and the paperback a year later. That's last year in 2015. That's already a year ago. But in my view, the tendencies that I attempted to chart have only deepened and accelerated with time. Our world is riven by war, climate change, inequality, and insecurity. I'm a barrel of laughs, by the way. You're gonna love it. I'll cheer up somewhere along the line, I promise. Europe, as you know, has been rocked by its greatest refugee crisis since World War II, and Britain by the nature and outcome of its Brexit debate. Now, all of this presents significant challenges for internationalism and human rights, which we might return to, not least in our discussion later on. But first, I'd like to go back to the beginning of my story. Now, as you've heard, after a time as a UK government lawyer, I went to work for Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties. That's the UK's leading domestic human rights campaign, and I was there for some years. And it was as its director that I came to speak at the Women of the World events at the Sydney Writers' Festival in 2013. Liberty had been formed in 1934. Now, sometimes I speak to younger audiences about 1934, and I can just see the eyes glazing over before me. You know, I explain to children and young people that 1934 was so different, a time before DNA was discovered, a time before the internet. My own son finds that almost impossible to imagine. You know, like, Mum, the internet's down, but permanently, because it's 1934. So yes, it was a time very, very different from the present. And yet, some things are different and some things not different enough. Because it was a time of profound economic uncertainty and inequality. Far-right movements were on the rise across Europe and even in the UK. And some of our great newspapers would regularly run headlines about how awful it was that so many refugees were coming from Eastern Europe. Now, given what we know happens next, and given the language was quite inflammatory and not so different from some of the language that we read in recent times, that perhaps was not the finest moment for parts of our British press. But the particular trigger for a call to action was the treatment of the hunger marchers. Now, these were people who marched all the way from the north of England to London's Hyde Park. They were protesting at the lack of jobs and food and shelter and life chances for their families. When they got to Hyde Park, and forgive the legal jargon, they were promptly duffed up by the Metropolitan Police. Of course, that would never happen today, would it? With a peaceful throng. It's very interesting. You get different reactions, again, according to people's level of cynicism, experience, whatever it is, about public order policing. And in particular, the method that was used was that some officers went undercover. They dressed as hunger marchers and went into that essentially peaceful throng and behaved violently in order to prompt and justify a more violent policing response, agent provocateur. And when that was revealed, it caused, as you can imagine, a significant outrage. And a group of people, small group of people, far smaller than the audience gathered here today, decided in true British fashion that something must be done. Now, of course, remember, it's 1934, so they can't blog or tweet or do anything like that. I can tell you're following this, right? It was no internet. No, it really doesn't exist. So something must be done, and so they have an old-fashioned meeting in the crypt of a famous old church called St. Martin in the Fields in Trafalgar Square. Some of you may know it. And they had their first meeting, and they wrote a letter to what was then the Manchester Guardian newspaper, today The Guardian. And they wrote about what they'd seen, how horrified they were at that crushing of peaceful dissent, and they told the editor that they had that day in February 1934 formed the National Council for Civil Liberties to keep watch over the entire spirit of liberty in the country. What an extraordinarily audacious thing to do. They had no royal charter, they had no sanction from government or anybody else. They were just a group of people. And they formed the National Council. Some of them were lawyers, some journalists, some political activists. But they became that spirit. They became the eyes to keep watch over liberty in the United Kingdom. Now, the next important moment in my story comes after World War II. And this, I think, is perhaps the most important moment, and one that we have to remind ourselves of now in these difficult times for the world. After the Holocaust and the Blitz, and the scenes of people coming out of Japanese prisoner of war camps and Nazi extermination camps, a group of people, slightly to the left and to the right of democratic politics all over the world, representatives of all the great world religions and people of no faith whatsoever, they come together in that unique moment. And we know, of course, about Eleanor Roosevelt in the US and Winston Churchill and Australia's own H.B. Everett, these people from around the globe coming together and deciding that if we as a human race aren't constantly to descend into barbarism and war, we have to agree on some non-negotiable values, ethical values that we can all share and cherish. And that, of course, is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. An extraordinary instrument with no hard legal effect, but inspirational effect, still today all over the world, even to people who struggle still and only dream of those values being made a reality. But what important values they are to bind us together. And of course, in turn and in time, those values were reflected in other treaty instruments that had more hard-edged effect. The International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, to which Australia is signatory, and so is the UK, the European Convention on Human Rights, and other regional instruments around the world. Now, lawyers often, rightly, set out in fairly technical terms the various articles of these treaties, in enumerating all the rights and freedoms. But for me, I sum up human rights with 3 words: dignity, equality, and fairness. Dignity, as in the idea that every single one of us is special, just because we're human, just because we're alive. That's anybody, good or bad, whatever the race, sex, sexuality, nationality, anywhere in the world, a newly arrived asylum seeker, a newborn baby, special, entitled to respect for their dignity. Fairness, as in procedural fairness, as in fair trials and due process, giving someone that fair hearing and consideration before making important decisions about them, in particular subjecting them to some kind of punishment or deprivation of a benefit. And equality, in particular, as in equal treatment under the law. Dignity, equality, and fairness. And I say, I hope for reasons that will become clear, I say that equality is perhaps the most important of these. But where does the idea of human rights come from? Famously, some people say that it's a nonsense, it's an aspiration, it's naive. I think there are 2 potential foundations for human rights thinking if you go back over time. The one, if you like, the one foundation is perhaps religious or spiritual, coming from this idea that human beings are perhaps modelled in the image of God, or, but in any sense, very much in keeping with this notion of human dignity. Every life is precious and not to be sacrificed, not to be used instrumentally, not to be cast aside or minimised even for wider benefit. And that has very wide appeal. And whilst faith communities are often caricatured, all sorts of faith communities caricatured and stereotyped as not supporting rights and freedoms, there are many faith communities that I've addressed who do readily embrace that idea of human dignity and embrace an idea of fundamental rights and freedoms, even if we sometimes disagree about the particular application. But if that sounds a little bit too spiritual for your taste, I think there's an equally important and valid alternative founding basis for human rights thinking. And that is essentially a democratic model. The understanding that without some non-negotiable rules of the game, democracy will be at best short-lived and at worst a complete illusion. Work with me for a moment. Imagine that a new premier sweeps to power with enormous popular support and a fantastic majority. And the honeymoon is fabulous, and on the crest of this political mandate, our premier, let's make her a woman, why not? Just for fun. Our new populist premier decides that the press are really quite annoying, even seditious, and perhaps they ought to be censored, in particular when they are critical of her or her party. She decides that the judges really ought to know their place as well. In the end, who elected them? She decides that some of her political opponents have been disrespectful of her mandate. And so it goes on to the point of finding that the next election is really too soon, given the difficult times that our country is facing, and given the cost of running and administering an election in difficult economic circumstances. So that is to be delayed as well. You see where I'm going with this. The abrogation of those individual rights and freedoms, including to free and fair elections, but before that to free speech, fair trials, and so on. The abrogation of those rights leads to the end of democracy itself. Now, I present that as a bit of a hypothetical, a bit of a fairy tale or a scare story, if you will, but we know, don't we, most of us, that that has been the reality in all sorts of systems all over the world, even in my lifetime. So, fundamental rights and freedoms become a regulatory framework for keeping democracy going, keeping that machine well-oiled, making sure it doesn't eat itself, making sure that today's democracy doesn't become tomorrow's very different society. The various rights and freedoms in these civil and political instruments have, of course, been under particular challenge since 9/11, but even before. And there are understandable reasons for that. When fear stalks the land, exceptionalism is often the order of the day. And it's very attractive and understandable to think that a simple trade-off can be made between these liberties and greater security. In the book, I try and spot certain trends that have become perhaps the most significant challenges to the notion and practice of human rights since that fateful atrocity of 9/11. The first, I think, to mention is perhaps the slow or not so slow death of privacy. The death of personal privacy, not just as an individual human right, but as a societal experience. Britain very quickly became renowned for being the CCTV capital of the world. This was a process we began before 9/11. Images of terrible crimes like the appalling murder of young Jamie Bulger all those years ago caught the public imagination in an understandably horrific way. And millions of pounds worth of crime prevention budgets were poured into cameras everywhere, without necessarily always a balanced assessment of the purpose of a camera, whether it was being maintained, where is and is not a proportionate venue for a camera, how long it should be there, whether it's even functioning, and so on. DNA became a very valuable tool in crime detection. But in the UK, it was taken from people who were suspected but often never charged, let alone convicted, of a crime. And so, once more, we brought ourselves to international recognition as a country for compiling over time the biggest per capita DNA database in the world. And of course, when you take DNA from so many people arrested but then set free, never charged or convicted, inevitably that database will have a disproportionate number of young black men on it, and protesters and so on. It's very similar to the way in which arbitrary stop and search becomes really not arbitrary but discriminatory in practice. Identity cards, once such a big debate in Australia, became a very significant debate in the UK. Before 9/11, but accelerated afterwards. It was if this card, this magic card, was the ultimate solution looking for a problem. 1 minute it was going to deal with border control, effectively by bringing the border to the streets, with all the recipe for discrimination that we have seen elsewhere. At one stage, it was going to help with benefit fraud, terrorism, all sorts of societal fears and legitimate concerns were going to be solved with the ID card. I even thought at one stage global warming would be solved that way, but apparently not. The concerns were, of course, the way in which identity papers or cards around the world have become a tool of oppression and discrimination on the street, but also because of the nature of technology and of the identity database that was being proposed in the UK, there were enormous concerns for data privacy. This was not just going to be a card with some information on it, visible to the holder and to the member of the security state. Behind the card would sit the big database. Information on it would grow and grow over time, as is the nature of some databases. And because it had no specific purpose, unlike a passport or a driving license or a health card, there would be nothing to stop the sensitivity and the amount of this data growing and growing. So, of course, that became a very, very important Liberty campaign. Our campaign was, in many respects, informed and inspired by the successful campaigns that took place here some years previously. And after a number of years, we prevailed. Legislation was passed, but eventually repealed before general implementation, well before implementation, by a coalition government in 2010. What a great campaign. People talk of it even to this day. But perhaps the joke is on us. I was an activist in that campaign, and yet today I carry in my bag, in my pocket, pretty much everywhere I go, something far more potent and intrusive than an identity card, a smartphone. And I pay for the privilege, and it's cool technology, and it connects to a number of other devices, and will tell anyone with reasonable wits where I am, who I'm with, who I've connected with, which websites I've looked at. What an insight into the intimate world. And this raises issues all over the world about the nature of internet privacy. Once upon a time, we thought of privacy as being about the physical world, and we developed, in different countries at different paces, protections to suit our cultural needs and our political will. In the UK, it is still the norm to have a magistrate's warrant before you search someone's premises. It is currently still the norm that a politician can authorise a phone tap, something that I think should be replaced with judicial warrantry. There are certain checks and balances, but what's being proposed in relation to the internet is surveillance of a blanket nature, without individuated suspicion and without independent warrantry, because the technology is there, and because we are rightly told that the internet is, whilst a wonderful and democratizing place, it also has its dark side. And that I would accept. We can't just leave it alone and think of it as an ungoverned space like Afghanistan or Somalia or somewhere like that. There has to be appropriate law around the internet, just as there has to be in the physical world. However, privacy matters. Privacy matters in the way that it connects with all other rights and freedoms. For example, how can you have fair elections without secret ballots? How can you have fair trials without confidential counsel? How can you have decent health care without medical confidentiality? And even free speech, which is often in tension with privacy, is often facilitated by anonymity. So surely there must be some balance. And rights and freedoms aside, Just in human terms, imagine a world with no privacy whatsoever. What would that look like? What would that feel like? To my mind, that would be a world with no intimacy between people, no dignity, and no trust. Not a very pleasant place to be at all. And yes, there are some bad things that are planned or perpetrated online, not least when we put too much information in certain places and don't protect it. But, bad things happen in the physical world too. Bad things happen in people's homes, and always have done. A domestic dwelling that has stood for long enough has probably been a crime scene. It could be anything from minor fraudulent activities to quite serious sex and violent crime that sometimes has gone on in the home behind closed doors. Now, we live in a world where the technology would now allow us to take a blanket approach to policing the home. We could say, couldn't we, that we would change the physical and legal architecture of our democracies so that there would be fairly unobtrusive cameras and microphones in everyone's home. And I don't even mean your home computer. It could be made law that there would be monitoring in everyone's home. But don't worry, because we're not going to look or listen unless you come to suspicion after the event. Right? Comfortable with that? There's always a bit of a mixture when you pose that question. We won't look. We have the capacity to record everything that goes on in the home, visually and audibly, but we won't look and listen until after the fact. Some people do cry out, "That's fine by me." And the slogan post 9/11 in the UK that grew up over time was, "Nothing to hide, nothing to fear." The innocent have nothing to fear from blanket surveillance. Really? Well, tell that to the hunger marchers who were abused by undercover policing that was unchecked. Tell that to environmental protesters, again back in the UK in more recent times. Now, these were, not jihadis, my friends, but, radical vegetarians, if you like. Right. The worst these women, in my experience, and I've met some of them, were going to be caught with was some dodgy quinoa. But they went to their local Greenpeace meetings and made friends with men who they thought shared their values. And some of them formed friendships and intimate relationships and partnerships that went on for years and even had, in some instances, children together. And years after the fact, when the relationship had ended and the man was there no more, they discovered that this was actually an undercover police officer from the special demonstration squad of the police, which raises issues that are bubbling away in the UK at the moment about surveillance of people who are not considered criminal suspects or terrorist suspects, but people who might be extreme or radical. There's a whole agenda that has developed in recent years around radical extremism and people being targeted for certain political views in the absence of reasonable suspicion of criminality. A blurring of the traditional roles of policing the civilian population on the one hand and espionage into foreign powers on the other. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. But surely we all have something to protect by way of intimacy, dignity, and trust. And I can put it no better than you will find it in that wonderful 1980s German film, The Lives of Others. If you haven't seen it, I do recommend that you look it up because it demonstrates the way that mutual mistrust and suspicion between family members and neighbours can really ruin the quality of life. The second theme that I think I touch on in much of the book is the demise of due process, fairness in the legal sense, procedural fairness before bad things happen to people. Again, 9/11 wasn't the start, but it became a very powerful catalyst for undermining traditional due process or fair trial rights. Now, we all know about Guantanamo Bay and internment there, which, of course, has yet to end all these years later. But we had our own experiments in detention and punishment without charge or trial in the UK as well. Immediately after 9/11, foreign nationals who were suspected of links with international terrorism, very loosely defined, found themselves detained without police interview or charge or trial in Belmarsh Prison in South London. Now, in the US, American lawyers must have advised the then president, Mr. Bush, that in order to achieve this kind of internment and to have an argument under the American Constitution, it was necessary to put foreign nationals offshore in Guantanamo Bay. In Britain, the experiment was tried onshore in South London. And a number of men were detained in that fashion for over 3 years until they were eventually considered by what was then the House of Lords and what is now our Supreme Court by way of the UK Human Rights Act, which makes the European Convention on Human Rights law in the UK. Now, the government of the time argued that this wasn't criminal detention at all, and therefore no fair trial rights were engaged. These people were all foreign nationals, and they were actually being detained pending a deportation that would never come. And the deportation could never come because these men would be, on the government's own case, these people would be tortured back home. So this was, in fact, not criminal detention, but immigration detention, and it was detention in a three-walled prison. That was the phrase used, and if the men wanted to go, they could take their chances with the torturers back home and leave at any time. Well, I'm glad to say that the House of Lords did not accept that argument and instead took the view that these men, in not being susceptible to deportation, were, for all material purposes, equivalent to British nationals suspected of links with terrorism who could not be deported either, because you can't deport your own citizens. And sometimes they were suspected of links with British citizens who were walking around and living their lives at liberty. And so the House of Lords found that this derogation of human rights and the right to physical liberty under the law was not strictly necessary. And it couldn't be strictly necessary because of this irrational discrimination. I think it shows the important discipline that discrimination principles and law bring to considering some of these questions. Now, when that judgment was issued, the government had to think again. And so what it did was to, and you're going to see this coming, decided that the policy would now not be discriminatory. It would be applied to British nationals as well. And they wouldn't be detained, but they'd be effectively under a form of house arrest, initially called control orders, and in more recent years, branded or rebranded TPIMs, terrorism prevention and information measures. But nonetheless, we have departed in the land of Magna Carta from that very basic principle that you shouldn't be detained on the basis of untested suspicion without charges, evidence, and proof. There were also experiments in lengthy pre-charge detention. First, 90 days was attempted and famously not got through Parliament by Mr. Blair. Then 42 days pre-charge detention was attempted under Mr. Brown, again unsuccessful, I'm glad to say. It went down to 28 days, and now the current limit for pre-charge detention is 14 days. This is not pre-trial. This is waiting to know what it is you're accused of. It's a very long time to be in a police cell without knowing why. My argument here would be that whenever somebody is suspected of and eventually charged with a serious offence, it might turn out to be vindicated or not. But it's important to begin the process of charge and the fair trial process as quickly as possible. And if in the end a person is vindicated by a jury, they will stand outside the Old Bailey or some other court with their lawyers, because everybody loves their lawyers when they need them, and their family members, and they will say justice was done. And they might feel that they've been robbed of some time, even years, if it was a terror trial or a very serious criminal offence, but they will feel vindicated, publicly vindicated by their day in court. If people are interned for long periods without interview, charge or trial, they literally feel like they've been disappeared and they have been cast aside and they have not been given due process. They don't have that sense of vindication, and that, I think, can be very counterproductive for the kind of strong and vibrant communities that actually provide national security by way of solidarity and intelligence in particular. Secrecy has also spread in various court systems as a bit of a contagion. And if one side in legal proceedings is allowed to make applications and share evidence with the court in secret, it can make for a very, very uneven system. But secrecy has certainly spread through our court system in the UK since 9/11 in particular, in both the criminal and civil systems. But I think, these are relatively particular cases and conditions that I'm talking about. Perhaps the biggest undermining of fair trial rights in the UK over the past more than a decade has been the demise of legal aid. I grew up in a country where if, as I once was, you were knocked down in the street by a car, you'd be scraped up and taken off to the emergency room without any concern for your means. If anybody looked through your pocket or your handbag, it would be to find your next of kin, not to look for any health insurance. That was the great thing about the NHS. But I also grew up in a country where if something bad was going to happen to you in legal terms, perhaps you might lose your job or your home or access to your children or your right to stay in the UK and so on, you would have access to legal advice and representation, regardless of your means, in the criminal context and in the civil law. I'm afraid that is simply no longer the case. And too many politicians of left and right have taken the view that law is little more than an irritation to power. That absolute power is delightful, and those who've earned it democratically need not be troubled by empowered citizens with advocates and advisors and the attentions of an independent judiciary. So legal aid has been all but obliterated, particularly in the civil system. A lot of vulnerable people losing out on their basic rights. And at times, lawyers have been attacked and denigrated, and even the judiciary undermined. Which brings me to my final trend, which I think has undermined the human rights ethic, certainly in the UK, but possibly elsewhere in the world as well. This move away from universalism to othering, right? The divide and rule, the idea that my fellow human being is somebody different, strange, scary, lesser than me. Now, we've seen it in all sorts of places close to home, with an agenda and a raft of orders and processes around something called antisocial behavior, something that isn't necessarily criminal activity, isn't necessarily a civil wrong, but it's a sort of hybrid that gives a lesser class of protection to the person who is suspected. It began perhaps with laudable aims back in the late 1980s, when it was thought that too many people were going to prison for petty crime, and there might be a form of civil order that could lead to a kind of injunction, a kind of warning that would keep younger people in particular and other people involved in petty criminality or bad behaviour out of serious criminal trials and sanctions. But by undermining the clear definitions of criminal behaviour, by undermining fair trial rights, the policy backfired and actually became a shortcut into the criminal justice system. People were given injunctions telling them not to swear or wear baseball hats or walk on the wrong side of the road for a whole range of behaviour that was thought likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress. Think about that. Behaviour causing harassment, alarm or distress. I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm quite easily harassed, alarmed and distressed, right, by young people who are too loud, by a mentally vulnerable person muttering, by all sorts of things that happen particularly in city life, but don't warrant a sanction that then, if breached, will turn that person into a criminal offender, particularly if they're young, particularly if they're mentally vulnerable, and so on. So that has been a very significant trend in the UK in recent years. But not everything has been legal in that way. A Welsh scientist developed a device called a Mosquito. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Mosquito or whether it's widely available here in Australia, but the Mosquito was a device that was premised on the fact that young people have more acute hearing, particularly in the higher registers, right? So it is possible to have an electronic device that will cause huge irritation and even pain to younger ears. But, middle-aged people like me are just not going to hear it. So this device became marketed on the internet and sold to individuals, private individuals, to attach to their homes, shopkeepers, anybody who wanted essentially to disperse young people, keep them away. What kind of a signal does that send to young people? It's indiscriminate. It's not based on bad behaviour or criminal behaviour. You could be a mother pushing a pram and not know why your baby or toddler is always crying when you walk past that particular fast food joint. And then older children and young people will know that causes them discomfort or pain, and they will keep away. Imagine if we said, men commit more petty crime than women, and there's a physiological difference, we will have a device that discriminates against men. What if we did it on racial lines? It would be intolerable, I would argue, in pretty much most societies in the world. Why is it acceptable to treat our young in that way? Well, it's a device that is still unregulated by law in the UK, and I'm told it is now sold elsewhere. And then, of course, the big one, the othering of the foreigner, the outsider. This has been a huge trend, I think, in my lifetime and in recent years in particular. Think about the language. Think about what the word refugee used to mean in the English language. To me, when I was a child in the 1980s, the word refugee was a noble word. It conjured up romantic images of Russian ballet dancers, and gymnasts and spies and tennis players and people from the Eastern Bloc who wanted to come to the free world and give us a vindication of our life, and they were going to escape to freedom. And it was a wonderful, noble concept. I think it was around 1988 that great liberal progressive US President Ronald Reagan went to Bergen-Belsen and made a famous speech where he said that he was a refugee. He identified with, Laotians and Cambodians and so on, people in boats desperate to flee. He identified with them. I wonder who would make a speech like that today. And the language changed, certainly in the UK. Refugees became asylum seekers, became bogus asylum seekers, and then, of course, the most recent iteration is migrant. Not a person, not a man, not a woman, not a child, not even a refugee, but a migrant, literally beginning to dehumanize that desperate person, just to make it a little bit easier to deny them the protection that those people in the post-war years decided they should have under the Refugee Convention. And the world has become so divided and so polarized. The rise of nationalism instead of internationalism and cooperation, fault lines around faith and other forms of identity as well. So much division, so much forced identity rather than fluid, multiple identity. I'm a woman, I'm British Asian, I'm a lawyer, I'm in Brisbane with all of you today. There are so many different things that I could say about myself at this moment. I think that I should be able to pick up different aspects of my identity and share them with different groups of people anywhere in the world, but it should come from me and it shouldn't be forced upon me. And my view is that too much identity is being forced upon people, and too many people are being forced to choose which side of any particular line they're on. Now, sometimes in life that's unavoidable, but it's a shame when it happens too often, when the haters force us to hate, to respond to their polarizing, terrorizing methods, to undermine our vibrant, open and democratic societies from within. These attempts have continued. It didn't end, of course, with 9/11. We had 7/7 in London. We had the Breivik attacks in Norway in 2011, and the very stoic but brave and realistic response of the Norwegian Prime Minister, Mr. Stoltenberg, who said that his open society would not be closed down in response. And I must commend to you a wonderful new memoir, painful but important memoir by Antoine Léry, whose wife was murdered in the Bataclan massacre last year. His memoir is called You Will Not Have My Hate. And it's a wonderful and uplifting, if at times very moving read. It seems to me that in difficult times, challenging, frightening times, it's all too easy to cast aside rights and freedoms. But as we remember, they were not made real and embedded by people unaware of the horrors and terrors of life. That wartime generation knew very well what they were doing. The importance of protecting life, outlawing torture and slavery, protecting us all from arbitrary detention and unfair trials, cherishing, even sometimes in a balanced way, our private and family life, protecting freedom of thought, conscience and religion, the right to the faith of your choice, to no faith, and indeed to being a heretic in any religious community, freedoms of speech and association, and as I said earlier, to my mind, the most important human right of all, equal treatment under the law. Now, why do I say that? Why would I suggest that that is more important than rights against torture and slavery? Well, it's just my opinion, but it seems to me that if we really had equal treatment in our hearts as well as in our political systems, the other violations just would not happen. If we walked around in other people's shoes, if we treated other people as we'd like to be treated ourselves, these other gross human rights violations just wouldn't happen. And when people denigrate human rights, they don't mean their own. They mean those of other people. My free speech is free. Yours, for 2 more minutes, is a little bit more expensive. And this is my experience of human rights debate when it becomes particularly toxic. Nobody really wants to cast aside the human rights of themselves and their family and their friends and people they can identify with. It's the stranger's rights that present the challenge, but also, I would argue, the opportunity. So we lawyers in legal speak call equality under the law non-discrimination, but perhaps we humans are better off thinking of it as empathy, loving other people's children as we would our own. And then there would be no migrants, just people and their children. So this framework of values, of course, does not create magic solutions to every global or domestic problem. It's not a computer program or a magic spell. It's a framework for ethical debate, political debate, and legal debate, but it is at least a framework to help us negotiate some very challenging times. Perhaps the greatest British jurist, and you've had so many great jurists here in Australia, but perhaps the greatest British jurist of recent times was the late, great Lord Tom Bingham, who was our senior law lord for some time and instrumental in the creation of our Supreme Court. And he addressed a Liberty anniversary conference nearly a decade ago now, and he listed all the rights and freedoms and explained them better than I ever could, and ended as follows. Are any of these rights trivial, superfluous, unnecessary? There may be some who would like to live in a country where these rights are not protected, but I am not of their number. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Shami. That was terrific and informative, and thank you for reminding us of the lessons of history, which are so important for where we are today to face the challenges and the trends that we're seeing that you've so eloquently articulated for our audience tonight. Colleagues, we have about 15 minutes or so for questions, so at this point I'd like to open it up to the audience. Please raise your hand.
Questions or comments, of course, or my favourite, which are comments very thinly disguised as questions. You know? And the way to do that is to have a little rant and then say, don't you think? But because you're Australian, the alternative is just to raise your voice at the end of a sentence. The French do it as well.
We have some questions from the audience. Yes, over here, to the right.
I'm actually a Briton living overseas here with a German wife, and I was very disheartened by the fact that I was not allowed to vote in Brexit. I was very disheartened that the European Court didn't give me that right, along with more than 1 million other people in a similar situation. I was of course, very disappointed by the result. And I was very disappointed now how the government is treating that as a very strong mandate to go down a path that seems to be madness. And I'm very disheartened that there is no formal or informal opposition to this Alice in Wonderland that we now live in, and that there's no parliamentary oversight of what's going on. Is there any hope for me?
Yes, there's always hope. Otherwise, why do we? Of course, there must be hope. You know, you remind me of the importance of hope, because I do have that sort of occupational danger of sort of sliding into the grim at times, don't I? I mean, this audience was very patient, but I could feel, there I am delivering the bad news again and again. I'm reminded of a time that I was speaking in Bristol to a large multidisciplinary audience, and a young woman scientist, brilliant scientist, came up to me very quietly at the end. She didn't take me on in front of everyone. She spared my blushes, and she said, "Shami, that was a wonderful speech about all these terrible things that are happening, extraordinary rendition." That wasn't beautiful singing, by the way. I know we're in an opera house. Kidnap and torture and all these terrible things that are happening. But Shami, please remember that Martin Luther King never said, "I have a nightmare." So I'm trying to work on the dream part, okay? So you can be my first challenge. I was very disheartened by the outcome of that vote as well, and not just by the outcome, by the tone of that debate. And okay, you can say people made, wild claims on both sides, but, there were proper racial epithets being used during that debate, and they were not really being called out. And, of course, it's interesting, isn't it? So you and the million like you who were excluded are, by self-description, internationalists. You're spending some time in another country, you're married to a German wife, and you get excluded. And I don't want to make a party political point, but I was very disheartened when our Prime Minister recently said, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, because, of course, that is the opposite to everything that I believe when I'm a human being first and foremost. So where's the hope? The hope is that my party, or the party that I've recently joined and signed up with, is going to get its act together. And we are going to be a more united and effective opposition. And we will work with other parties in both houses of Parliament to provide an effective opposition and to ask some very difficult questions about what the plan is and where this is going. And we must insist on parliamentary scrutiny of whatever it is that's proposed, because you're quite right. What's currently on offer is smoke and mirrors, and nobody knows. So there's got to be a plan, and we've got to hold government to account. In the end, if they can't convince the majority of the British people of the destination as opposed to the door, I suspect that there will be a demand for further elections, not necessarily further referenda, but for democratic elections if the government can't convince Parliament and the people that it has some kind of plan.
Further questions, colleagues? There's a hand up in the middle and one down in the front.
Thank you, Baroness, for that very enlightening...
Oh, Shami, please.
For that very enlightening discussion. I'm just curious, you've talked about how many of the older generations have personal experience that have, led them to fight for particular liberties, and perhaps because of all of their efforts, many people in my generation are very fortunate to have no personal experience or very little personal experience of a lot of the erosions that you're talking about. I'm wondering, I'm sure that in your long and distinguished career you've come up with many tactics to bring about some empathy or understanding to younger generations, or to people who don't realise that perhaps they could be the next refugee or whatever. So I was wondering if you could share some of those strategies and tactics with us.
Well, I don't know about long and distinguished career, because I want to feel young like you. But no harm intended. I think the best tactic is storytelling, because we are, I believe, storytelling creatures. And one can be hypothetical and technical, but there's nothing like real examples and real stories. So, for example, one of the things I didn't talk about was the advent of summary extradition. Again, after 9/11, it became understandably a concern of governments that they should be able to shift people around the world if they were suspected of doing bad things, and they should be able to do it quicker, without due process. And it seemed like a really good idea at the time when it was all going to be jihadi, suspected terrorists. But actually, it ended up happening to businessmen, notoriously to a man called Gary McKinnon, who had Asperger's syndrome and was looking for UFOs online and managed to hack into the Pentagon. Don't ask me how, I can barely use my smartphone. but he could do this, and then he was a wanted man, etc., etc. And these real stories of what it might feel like to be sent off somewhere without due process really captured the imagination of lots of people in Britain who never thought it could be them. And people who are, very happy sometimes to see people deported without due process, including deported to places of terror. People who might be terror suspects don't imagine that the suspect could be them. But someone like a Gary McKinnon, a man from northwest London with Asperger's syndrome, was public enemy number one in the Pentagon. He was the equivalent of a terrorist. But in Britain, he was a dear boy whose mum was trying to save him. And I think that's sometimes what we have to do. We have to capture people's imagination with how it could actually be them. And there's a chapter in my book called The Law of Unintended Consequences, which covers many of these examples of injustice, not to foreigners or terror suspects, but to people who you never thought these dangerously broad laws could be applied to.
I think we have a question here in the front.
Well, I don't have a question, just a comment. And I guess I wanted to, thank you, because I really agree with the argument that you put to the audience that people actually do need to oppose and resist the crackdown on civil liberties that's happening internationally everywhere. But I guess I also want to make an argument about why, at the same time as opposing these crackdowns, we also have to oppose racism. And here in Australia, we're seeing, constant legislation being introduced in the name of racism. A couple of years ago, there was the Barwon 13 incidents where, 13 Muslim men were sentenced because of talk in their mosque discussing with one of their religious leaders that what is the morality of a terrorist attack. And they were arrested and locked up for 2 years without trial. And I guess this can happen because of the extreme Islamophobia that exists in today's society. So yes, on one hand, we do need to oppose these crackdowns, but on the other, we need to oppose the extreme racism that's coming more and more to the front with, the introduction of Hanson coming back into the mainstream political sphere. Since she's come back, there's also been the discussion on repealing the Racial Discrimination Act 18C, which basically will allow people to verbally discriminate and abuse people on the basis of their race, or, the fact that we lock up refugees and torture them. I guess we have to take a stand against racism, side with the oppressed, because people always say, Muslims are, 100 years ago, Jews, I suppose. So how easy can it change? That's my comment.
Well, obviously you know your Australian context better than I do, but it sounds pretty familiar to me, because we've seen a rise in Islamophobia and in other forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. Since the Brexit vote, we had the police report a spike in hate crime against all minorities. And I think this is something I feel very strongly about. Racism is racism. And there aren't good and bad forms of racism, and people really ought to be able, at this point in the 21st century, to imagine from historical examples, from their own lives, what it is to be the person in that marginalised and oppressed category. And that point about talk, I think, is really important. People feeling suspect in the mosque or back home in the university, in the classroom. We have a programme called Prevent, which was about, again, countering extremism, but in practice has become something that makes a lot of Muslim families nervous about their small kids going and drawing pictures in the classroom, or what the PhD student might be reading in the library. And there are all these stories of perfectly peaceable, thoughtful young Muslim people in particular feeling watched and suspected just for having the kind of discussions that we must have. And this is where sometimes these policies become so counterproductive, because in the end we as democratic societies and communities are each other's best defence. and not just in some sort of high-minded philosophical way, but in practical terms. You know, we want young Muslim people and young people from all communities to do things like join the police, and to feel the kind of solidarity that means that if you genuinely thought that someone was about to do something, you would give your intelligence and you would report because you feel part of society and not excluded from it. So I think you're completely right about racism, all forms of racism, you know, including Islamophobia, and the erosion of civil liberties and the rise of arbitrary power is often in history used in a racially discriminatory way.
We have time for one or two more questions here in the back.
I was very interested to be reminded again of your opposition to identity cards in the UK. And I'm just wondering, what would your reaction have been if 5 years ago the government of India, the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, would have asked you what your opinion was of the UID program in India, where there are tens of millions of people who have no identity, and because they have no civil registration documents or identity, they are denied a bank account, they can't get healthcare, they can't move around the country. They are not only untouchable, but they are without identity, and they want identity. So what would you have said to
I think you've got a problematic mic, but not a problematic point of view. And I think so just to repeat what I think is the gist of your point for people who couldn't hear, I think you're making an argument that I've heard before, particularly in the developing world, particularly with mass populations, sometimes disenfranchised people who really need an identity document because they're not getting access to all sorts of important public services because of their lack of any kind of identity proof. What I would say is I'm not against purpose-specific identity documentation. I've got no problem with, you know, I carry multiple identity, don't I? I've got a passport, I have banking card, I have a unique NHS number and tax number, and now, of course, in the world of Apple, etc., we all have these various passwords. I don't know whether you choose to use your thumb as ID or your you know, there are all sorts of things that people sign up to, but I don't believe in putting all my eggs in one basket and giving it to one agency called the state, or frankly called one big computer company that has sovereignty over me. I think what you need are purpose-specific identifiers, a number of different ones, if you don't put all your eggs into one basket to be hacked or defrauded or surveilled. But I've got no problem at all with people having particular documents or particular identifiers, but the information that then sits behind that would be limited to what is necessary for that purpose: the tax system, the health system, the passport system, and all of this does not have to be linked in one place, in my view.
Thanks, Shami. We have time for one last question, and we have lots of hands up, but to you, sir.
Thank you. Shami, I wanted to ask you, as a political junkie, when I get sick of watching Australian politics, I've paid quite a bit of attention to your countries. And in your talk...
You really are a junkie then, aren't you?
Yes.
Desperate.
Desperate. But you've spoken just now about the importance of, I think, parliamentary institutions. But one trend I've noticed inherent in the Westminster system is that we often get governments or lower houses of parliament that are not representative of the diverse political views of the population, which is why I guess I'm in favour of proportional representation. So my question is, do you agree? And if so, how do we, A, convince the rest of the population that such a thing is necessary, and B, how do we convince our major parties to vote for a change that is fundamentally against their own political self-interest?
Well, to go to the last bit of your question first, I'm not sure it is wholly against all sorts of party self-interest, and it's not surprising that political parties sometimes change their views about all sorts of things to do with boundaries, voting systems, etc., according to how they think it will it will fit with their immediate needs. I'm not sure whether PR is the answer, because I think it can produce. I think with or without a proportional representative system, you end up with deals and negotiations and coalitions. They're either in a big party or they're across a number of smaller parties. And one way or another, people don't always get what they think they voted for. So I'm not someone who has very strong opinions about this issue. I think at the moment in Britain, with the European question, and frankly even the UK question, because there's talk of another Scottish referendum, right? So I think we probably, realistically, in Britain, have bigger priorities right now. However, I think there are a lot of people, including in my party and in other parties, who are sympathetic to your point of view, and it may well come in Britain in the longer term. Whether it is necessarily always a better system, I don't know. The really important thing, I think, for me is that people get involved. That, for all its problems, and my party does have significant problems at the moment, it is currently at over 500,000 people, the biggest or the most numerous political party in Europe. And that is, some people find that scary, and other people like me find that exciting. And I think those people need to be involved and to be active in policy making. I want to see people from more diverse backgrounds put themselves forward for election and so on. That's the kind of transformation that I'm sort of quite excited about. The precise voting system, I'll leave to political junkies and experts like you.
Thanks, Shami. Ladies and gentlemen, please.